I love people who write, and I think, lawyers are natural writers because they're also voracious readers. Most lawyers have had to read a lot. That's why Grisham and them, lawyers are just great storytellers because there's just so much content that you have to pour through. What was the entry point for this story? Where did this come from?
So this story was really motivated and inspired by the Mother Emanuel massacre. June 17, 2015, I was on maternity leave with my second son. And, when that massacre happened, and it was just like, I had never experienced anything like that in my lifetime. I'm 40 years old. I wasn't around in the 1950s and 60s. And I had never seen that type of hatred that was so in your face. And it was so shocking that it came from such a young person, a teenager at that. And so, it was like, what's been put into his mind in his few little years on earth that he would feel this way to, walk in a church and kill 9 innocent people that welcomed him into the fold. But more importantly, I was looking at my baby son and thinking, how do I prepare him to grow up in a world where people are going to feel that way about him? What kind of context does he need to understand to interact and engage and just be prepared? And when I started looking into the history of the church, I was really surprised to find out that it was founded by Denmark Vesey, who the name may be familiar. He led one of the largest attempted slave revolts out of Charleston, South Carolina. It was thwarted in the early 1820s. And then I read that the pastor of the church during the Reconstruction era was a man named Richard Kane, and he was also one of the first Black members of Congress. And then I saw that like Booker T. Washington used to speak at the church, and Coretta Scott King all the way up into the 1960s led a protest and was met by bayonet-wielding members of the South Carolina National Guard. And then you go up to 2015, and the pastor, Clementa Pinckney, was also a South Carolina state legislator. And when I saw the history of America kind of through that arc and through that lens of the church, all the dots really connected. And I was like, I've got to find a way to tell a story that bridges this history so that people growing up right now today can kind of see the whole picture of what's happening. And it was even more jarring, because in that moment, I think most of the country was feeling like we were, experiencing a new day in America, with the election of the first Black president. And, there was so much progress that was occurring that I think, a lot of us felt like maybe the worst of our racial history was behind us. And then to be hit with that moment, it was like, well, maybe it's just on pause. And if we're not prepared, it'll be right in our face again. So that was the inspiration behind the story.
Wow. The inspiration is so good. Now I got to read the book. Right? Like when you start talking about the history and putting and connecting the dots, I feel like honestly that's so much of what we're missing about how amazing our legacy is in this country, right? Like we have so much of what we're fed and what's pushed upon us is it's trauma porn, right? Like we need to have stories about enslavement, right? But we need to have that contextualized with the fact that we have been fighting and uprising and building and loving and creating community and persevering in the midst of all of these things, right? Like we need more stories that connect our incredible perseverance and ability to make so much out of what seems and feels like nothing, to have that context so that younger Black kids cannot think that their entire history is just enslavement and just back of the bus, right? Like there's gotta be something to connect that dot. And I honestly think it's literature and it is art. Yes, where we're gonna find that.
I mean, I'm so glad you said that. And I forgot to even say the name of my book. My book is Black Was the Ink. It comes out on November 2nd. So definitely check it out. But
that was my responsibility. I apologize. I got so caught up in the story.
That's okay.
I apologize. Black was the ink. Black Was the Ink. We'll tweet it out as well so people can get their pre-order. November what?
November 2nd.
Okay. All right.
Yes,
A
but
couple
that,
weeks-
I mean, what you just said, that was the spirit that the story was written in, because it's like our whole story is like overcoming, you know, every obstacle that's been placed in our path, we have found a way to resist the oppression and overcome. And so in my story, the present day teenager, Malcolm, his name is Malcolm, he gets transported to Reconstruction era America. And all of a sudden, he is working side by side with Black congressmen. And there were 15 Black congressmen in the 1870s. Two of them were United States senators. How many people know that fact? I didn't know that fact growing up, but it says something, right? And some of the places that Malcolm's visiting while he's in the past, one place is called the Wormley Hotel, and it was this super like fancy, fine establishment across the street from the White House. If you ever go to DC, if you go to Joe's, I think it's called
Cafe.
Joe's Crab Shack. Yeah. That's where the Wormley Hotel was. And that hotel was owned by a Black man. Okay. And all types of dignitaries and congresspeople and everybody would hang out at his hotel. And it was like everything that the formerly enslaved people must have felt when slavery ended, and they really felt like they were entering this new day of freedom. I wanted to embody that spirit. Like, what did it feel like when you could walk away from those shackles and make your life what you wanted it to be and have these freedom and opportunities? And that existed for about a 10-year period until there was an uprising of domestic terrorism, you know, fueled by white supremacy that resulted in massacres and murders and, you know, all types of, you know, horrible things that really changed the direction of the country into the Jim Crow era. And so when people talk about a slow moving coup or an attempted coup, I think it's really important to remember that at least one time in our history, there's already been a successful coup. And that was how they ended you know, Reconstruction through violence and turned us, you know, into a different period of a second enslavement through Jim Crow laws.
866-801-8255. Michelle Coles, civil rights attorney, who wrote a book. It comes out in November 2nd. Black Was the Ink. What was the process for you? Because you're a lawyer, you're doing this work by day.
Yeah.
You're raising children.
Yeah.
When did you have time to write and talk about, you know, the page coming alive for you?
Yeah. Well, I mean, so I mentioned I was on maternity leave, and I have 4 boys. And I was on maternity leave.
What? Wait a minute.
How you write in a house with 4 kids?
Yeah.
No, wait, 4 boys though, Drew.
I do from 8 to 1. They're 8 to 1.
Jesus.
Yeah, so I'm busy, but you know what? I'm writing. I wrote this story for them, and I wrote it with their survival on my mind and on my heart, and so I couldn't stop. You know, I couldn't take a break, because it's like the whole time I'm writing, there's another, you know, unarmed Black man being shot by a police officer. There's another story of a Black kindergartner kid being handcuffed and taken out of the classroom. There's another, you know, this after the other. And it's like, I can't let that be my kids. You know, like I have to give them the knowledge, and hopefully other kids the knowledge, so that we can figure out how to turn this corner and, you know, put these type of like horrible incidents in our rearview mirror instead of in our future. And so that motivated me. But yeah, I was on maternity leave with my second. And in that time, I started researching, because I knew some about the Reconstruction era, but it's really skipped over almost entirely in schools. And so most people, you know, I, like most people, did not know a lot about it. And so I spent a lot of time researching. You know, Eric Foner is a huge academic in this field, reading his books. Henry Louis Gates did an awesome PBS special on Reconstruction. Will Smith, I mean, this was after I'd already written the book, but if you haven't seen Will Smith's Amend on, I think it's on Amazon, you know, that's about, I mean, that was basically a nonfiction version of what my book is, you know, in a fiction way. And so I spent a lot of time researching, and then I would just write at night after I put my kids down. I would just kind of start my third job. I had my civil rights job in the day, being a mom after work, and then start my third job as an author once I got them to bed, and, you know, just kept going.
You talked about in your sort of ideation about Reconstruction era Black folks who sat at the epicenter of power. And I only know Hiram Revels because of the Mississippi connection growing up in Mississippi. And I know that Blanche Bruce too, but but how did you think through how much of like actual history do I drop in here? And then how much do I fictionalize to make it, do we have appearances from real life, historical figures and fixtures in this too?
Yes. So my character, Malcolm, he's kind of trapped between two worlds, the present and the past. Okay. So he's spending about half his life in the present, still dealing with modern day racial injustices. The state, he's in Mississippi. He was sent to stay on his family's farm in Mississippi, and the state's trying to take his family's land to expand a highway. They had already.
Real happens all the time in Mississippi too, and in the South. Louisiana, Mississippi.
Yeah, it happened to my family.
Stolen so much Black land, but
yeah. And so so much of what's in this book is actually based on like the experiences of my family, my history, South Louisiana, Baton Rouge. And so the state is trying to take their land. And that's actually what sets off the whole story, is because Malcolm's ancestor, comes to him in like a ghost form, and he was the one that had originally got the land. And he's like, Malcolm, you can't let him take my land. And, but Malcolm's not from there. He doesn't care about farms. He's from DC. He's living a city life. He's like, he could care less. And so the ancestor wants to take him on a journey so he can understand what that land means and what sacrifices took place for them to have that land. And so that's what really sets off the journey to Reconstruction era America. But while he is in the 1870s, so the ancestor Cedric, when he was alive, he was a legislative aide to the first Black members of Congress. And so he worked for Hiram Revels. That was his first, So when the ancestor sends Malcolm to the past, he sends him back into his body. And so now Malcolm all of a sudden is working with Hiram Revels. And so first he works with Hiram Revels, then he ends up working because Hiram Revels only stayed for a year in the Senate. So then he works with a man named Robert Elliott, who is a congressman from South Carolina, who is just beyond incredible. Like, if you go and read some of this man's speeches, he was so eloquent. And I mean, he like gave one of the most incredible speeches, which I fictionalize in my book, where he was debating, there was a Civil Rights Act that ended up getting passed in 1875. So it was the Civil Rights Act of 1875. And it was basically like a precursor for the 1964 Civil Rights Act. It had a lot of the same provisions. And it was a very heated debate in Congress back in the 1870s of whether they should pass this. And this bill would, prohibit discrimination in basically all places open to the public. And so there was a big debate. And on one side of the debate was Robert Elliott. And on the other side of the debate was a congressman from Georgia whose name was Alexander Stephens. And he had been the vice president of the Confederacy. Okay, they let this man back in Congress. For a period, they said the former Confederate soldiers, y'all fought against your country. You were traitors. You can't serve in Congress. That only lasted a couple of years. And then they were like, okay, all's forgiven. Y'all can come back. So Alexander Stephens is debating Robert Elliott. Okay. And Robert Elliott wipes the floor with this man through his speech and through his arguments. I mean, he literally, like he said, the Congress has been gracious enough to allow you to come back in here, and you're going to come in here and try to besmirch the Constitution. And I mean, it was crazy. Like the newspapers went wild. The people in the audience in Congress went wild. And, and it's like, here it is. And I have to add, he was a dark-skinned Black man. Okay. And people don't even know really, like, it's real murky what his background was. It's unclear whether he was enslaved or because it was like he was a lawyer. He spoke multiple languages. He could quote the Greek, the classics. And if you had been a slave, like, how would you have access to this kind of information? Because it was, you'd be killed for trying to learn how to read or write. So some people said he was raised in England. Some people said Jamaica. It's very murky where Robert Elliott came from. But he is amazing, and everyone should know his name and read his speeches. But that's just one example. There's plenty of examples in the book. And then after Robert Elliott, my character ends up working for Blanche Bruce. So he goes from Hiram Revels to Robert Elliott to Blanche Bruce. And that's what brings him eventually back to Mississippi, where he buys the land for his family. That Malcolm
in real time.
Yeah.
In real time, he saves the day.
Yeah.
You know, but as you're talking, I'm also thinking again, I said this earlier, that we are doomed to repeat history if we don't learn from it. To have all those Black people in Congress who are ready on day one to serve and to lead their communities, right?
Right.
Within 5 years, they were all gone.
Yeah.
Because this government decided to let traitors back in and not hold them accountable, which we're seeing the same thing happen from January 6th. Traitors are not held accountable. Right. And then we even have people covering for them whose lives were on the line, like Mike Pence, covering for them to set the table for reclaiming of power, because they understand it's really about power. And there aren't two sides when it comes to power, right? So a lot of those Black people that served in Congress with distinction were drummed out, were threatened with their lives. Yeah. And most of them did not run for re-election because they were threatened. A lot of them, left, to preserve their lives and their family. What can we learn moving forward? You're in civil rights. You're an attorney. You understand how this goes. Are you optimistic about where we are right now politically?
I think there are some dark storm clouds on the horizon, definitely. But I feel like we have to remain hopeful. I feel like our people have never been a people to just give up and throw our hands up. Like, I feel like we have to be hopeful. And for me personally, I feel like the hope is in trying to bridge the divide through talking to one another and sharing our stories and trying to expand people's perspectives. And so that's a big reason why I wrote this book. I mean, not only were Black people doing incredible things in the Reconstruction era, but the white allies at that time were also, incredible and really wanted to see America be realized as a nation that, fulfilled the promises in the Declaration of Independence of, equal opportunity for all and all, everything that America could be. And so it wasn't just Black people that were trying to make that dream come true. It was white people like Senator Charles Sumner and Congressman Benjamin Butler and the people who didn't get monuments, made after them. And so a lot of the people that did, they didn't have that same vision for how we could be a united country. But the ones who did have that vision were forgotten and erased, by history. And so I think it's very important to elevate them as well. And one of the characters in my story in the present day is a young white boy who initially Malcolm and this guy have an altercation. And it doesn't go well. And through the story and through that young man also being exposed to a part of history that he wasn't aware of, it also sparks something in him where he wants to be a part of bringing about a positive change and making sure justice is done. And I do think that there is potential for that if we keep talking to each other and sharing our stories with one another.
I love it. Did you read Octavia Butler's Kindred?
I did. Not before. I actually didn't read it before I started writing this, but I read it. I read it afterwards and I was like, oh my gosh, I love it. I'm feeling it so much. Yes.